Khan's view there, and Douglas Murray and Sarah Khan join me now. Douglas Murray, you wrote a book, Strange Death of Europe. What did you mean in your film when you say, let's get serious?
Well, several things. Just one example, let me give you. The young man who carried out this atrocious attack last Monday night was for 2 years a student at Salford University. He was on a campus which is, from its leadership to its student leadership, opposes all aspects of the government's only counter-extremism programme. They not only oppose it, they boast that they're boycotting it. They always did this. The university that he was at was against the only counter-extremism policy this state has. This
Talking
is just
about
one.
Prevent.
Yes,
yes.
This is just one example of a much bigger problem.
What are you suggesting, though? Shut down the university, force them to change their policies?
I think that a university which, in the case of Salford, for instance, encourages students to report racist attacks, which is quite right, but discourages them from reporting any Islamic extremism is a serious problem, because, after all, if you spend years telling people not to report Islamic extremism and then discover that you've produced a suicide bomber in Manchester, I think you should be held accountable.
Sarah Khan, what do you say to that?
I think it's quite clear through my own experience that there have been politicians who have undermined Prevent. There have been community organisations, indeed there have been Islamist groups in this country that have been at the forefront of undermining and countering Prevent, but also a wider counter-extremism measures. And I think we have to really start getting real in recognising the fact that Islamist extremism has flourished in this country. You know, if somebody had given us a crystal ball 10 years ago when the 7/7 bombings had happened and said, look forward and you're going to see the fact that we've had hundreds of people leave this country to join ISIS, that we've had hundreds of people being convicted of Islamist offences, I think we'd be quite shocked as to the fact that things have got worse as opposed to getting better.
Right, but Douglas Murray, the essence of your argument when you made those comparisons between the number of Muslims in different countries, is it that we've got too much Islam in Britain?
Well, look, the answer that the Muslim Brotherhood and other extremist groups give is that the answer to absolutely everything is Islam. I think less Islam in general is obviously a good thing.
Really?
Because the Islamic world, let me finish, the Islamic world is in the middle of a very serious problem, and it has been going on since the beginnings. And I think that it is not worth continuing to risk our own security simply in order to try to be politically correct.
Would you support that sort of
No,
measure?
I mean, I would disagree with Douglas on that and say, look, nobody is going to deny that since the end of the 20th century, you know, there's been a rise in Islamist extreme terror organisations. But the fact of the matter is what's really happening now, that yes, there is a crisis within contemporary Islam, but there's a clash at the moment. There's competing claims of what the faith stands for. So yes, while we're seeing Islamist terrorist organisations, at the same time, there are leading religious theologians who are saying to Muslims that, for example, that the concept of a caliphate is utterly outdated and that Muslims should be embracing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and adopting a human rights culture.
If I may just pick up on that very quickly, I entirely agree with Sarah on that. There are obviously people trying to counter this. However, I would urge us to take the long view. In the history of Islam, there have been many reformers, and most of the time they've ended up being the ones on the brunt of the violence and the ones being killed. I deeply admire what Sarah and other people do in this country. I want them to win. But the evidence out there is that they are not only a minority, but the most beleaguered minority. Take a poll that was taken last year in this country. It found that 2/3 of British Muslims said they would not report a family member they found to be involved in extremism to the police. I mean, really, this is a very serious problem.
But the measures you're proposing, of course, are far more draconian because, as you say, you don't think they can win the majority.
No. I'm saying I wish that they could. I hope they could. We should do everything we can to support people like Sarah, but we should also recognise that the scale of the problem out there is beyond our current understanding.
How do you counter, Sarah, radicalisation that can happen on a university campus, or it can happen online? The discussion we had with Ben Wallace, the Security Minister, about the amount of material that is out there. But if we really pursue in a hardline way, perhaps the sort of thing that Douglas Murray is suggesting, then gone is freedom of speech, gone is free debate and discussion as they will see it.
I've always said that the best way and the most effective way of countering extremism is through the prism of human rights. We cannot abandon our human rights to fight extremism. And I have to say, where I think we are going wrong, where there's the hole, the gap, is that the lack of counterwork in actually challenging the Islamist ideals. That when you put up the Olaki image there, how many people are actually going to say we need to now counter that very strict anti-Western narrative, the Islamist ideals? That's where we are really not doing enough work.
And what about the human rights point, though, that that you cannot take away other people's human rights in order to protect ours.
I've not suggested, and I'm not suggesting anyone has their human rights taken away. I'm suggesting that we do things that make sure that 22 people don't get blown up on an average Monday again. Okay? The idea that it is against human rights to, for instance, ask people simply to be opposed to people who wish to blow up our daughters in a pop venue on a Monday night, that isn't restricting human rights. It's not restricting human rights to say that if you're taking government money and you're an institution like Salford University, you should be held responsible for not cooperating with the standard security measures.
I don't disagree with that, but I'm saying you can challenge extremism without having to abandon human rights. And in my organisation, there's a lot of work going into Muslim communities, working with teachers, where we're saying we've got to actually counter the Islamist narrative. We are not doing enough of that. So it's not about, this is not about actually closing down free speech. This is actually encouraging more of it to say, and that this is the most effective way of countering the Islamist narrative.
So why isn't it doing better? Why isn't it reaching and spreading in the communities themselves?
There's a number of reasons. One of them is the fact that there's a denial taking place, there's a lot of apologetics taking place, and part of it is also the way we talk about Muslims in this country. We use this term Muslim communities as if they're a homogenous, monolithic trend. The fact is that there's a very positive trend, there's also a very negative trend amongst British Muslims, and we need to counter those who are promoting the idea that Muslims need to be part of a global Islamist identity.
I absolutely agree. It's also the case that there is massive pushback because for a lot of Islamists in this country, they are defending the faith as they see it. We think we could advise them to a better path, but they think they are defending absolutely everything, and we need to get real about that.
Douglas Murray and Sarah Khan, thank you both.
And the author of that little narrative, Douglas, is still with us. And we've been joined by the political editor of the New Statesman, Mehdi Hassan. You two have crossed swords on this issue before.
Have we?
Publicly, hotly. The thing is, the rhetoric is heated. Let me just throw some of it at you immediately, Mehdi. So Douglas says, discussing multiculturalism, it means that if you were a white English girl born into a white English family and your family decided to marry you against your will to a randy old pervert, the state would intervene. But if you had the misfortune to be born into an Asian background family and the same happened, the state would look the other way. Is he not even allowed to say those things?
Of course he is. Who said he wasn't? I mean, there's a lot of straw men in this debate. No one says Douglas is not allowed to express his view. In fact, the dominant narrative right now is anti-multiculturalism. In fact, I'm the minority here in a different sense, not Douglas in terms of the debate. And of course, no one says it's racist to be opposed to multiculturalism. Of course not. What I would say on that specific issue that you raise, for example, forced marriages, is it's just not true. The state doesn't look the other way. The Foreign Office and the Home Office have a unit that goes out to Pakistan to rescue British girls who've been sent out there. And no supporter of multiculturalism, and I would count myself as one, defends forced marriages on multicultural grounds. So it's the whole thing is a straw man argument.
And that is an accusation levelled at many of those who argue from your standpoint that you paint with far too broad a brush. For example, you talk about immigrants despising the country they live in. How many immigrants despise the country they live in?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be a very large percentage for it to cause huge problems, as we learned in 2005, to our great cost. First of all, I don't agree that
They weren't immigrants.
No. I'm saying people who come to this country and who are then taught and acquire a sense of hatred towards this country. First, I mean, what we're seeing in Britain is a form of reverse assimilation. People are less integrated this generation than their parents and grandparents because there is less desire and to actually get involved in the country they're in. And another thing, this isn't a straw man argument about the forced marriage issue because, yes, it's true the FCO has now got a forced marriage unit. It was very late in coming. And the phenomenon of girls of Asian background being married off had been going on for decades until government got involved.
No one's denying that, but it wasn't going on because of multiculturalism.
I don't want to get hung up on forced marriages because we could talk about... We're talking about the broader aspect of multiculturalism.
But Douglas is just wrong to say that a younger generation is not as integrated.
But you can't have it both ways because on the one hand you have said yourself that it alienates particularly the British Muslim community when people paint in the brushstrokes that Douglas is using. So you talk about the alienation, yet when he talks about the alienation, you say it's not true.
That's apples and oranges is different. I mean, I'm talking about alienation that we're creating right now. I'm not talking about the last 40 years of which Douglas is basically indicting 40 years of integration
but where
of immigrants.
Where are we now, do you think?
Where are we now? Well, let me just take one poll, to bring some facts into the debate. In 2009, Gallup did extensive polling of Muslim communities across Europe. They found that British Muslims were more likely to identify with Britain than non-Muslim Britain, 77% to 50%, they found that British Muslims were more keen on living in mixed areas than segregated areas than non-Muslim Britain, 68% to 57%. So I don't buy this caricature from the right, which says all young Muslims are out to blow stuff up and don't like living here.
And it was
not
very
me,
interesting.
not anyone I know, none of my friends.
Andrew raised a very interesting point. I mean, you were describing the bombers as immigrants. At what point do people cease to be immigrants in this country and become, in your mind, nationals or British or part of the landscape?
As a friend of mine who immigrated here himself says, the point where you become British is the period where you realise you don't get any extra rights than anyone else, any extra sensitivities than anyone else, any extra inducements than anyone else.
You get respect for your culture, Douglas.
All you get is to put up with the same crap the rest of us get to put up with. That's the deal. No extra things. And the thing is that at the moment, the dominant narrative of British life has become lost. And this is what I was trying to say in the film, is that everyone can, as it were, argue their rights, their background, their culture, other than British rights, British culture, British norms. I think it makes it a lot easier to integrate people if you know what you're integrating into.
You imply there's a difference between British culture and kind of minority rights. They're not. No. It's all one and the same thing.
We
come together.
But sometimes they run very much...
Culture evolves.
You two tend to joust frequently, but I'm very keen to just unpick some of this. At the last election, even the Labour Party held up their hands and they said, you know what, we made white working class people feel alienated. We drove them, we herded them into the hands of extremists.
Well, as we know, the Labour Party could be wrong on a lot of things.
So they were wrong about that?
Well, one of the people who was saying that, of course, was then disqualified from his seat for race baiting in Oldham. So I'm not going to take lessons from Phil Willis on what integration looks like. But just on the specific
point of
terrorism...
the message. I want to know about the message. You think that message was wrong?
I think there is an issue with working class communities, white working class communities, insecurity. I think that's an economic issue. To pretend it's about language or forced marriages or these issues is rubbish.
And I've
got to address this terrorism point. Sorry, the 7/7 bombers. Very briefly, you've had a long film. The 7/7 bombers, let me just make a very specific point, could speak English, married of their own accord, played cricket. They were not in forced marriages or...
I have to let Douglas Murray have a final word on this.
This is the tragedy, is that there are people in this country who do not feel loyalty to this country, who do not feel they have to have any loyalty to this
political
country.
differences,
And we saw there one of the end points that can reach.
All right, gents, I have to call time on this. Very fascinating and something I know we'll come back to. Thank you.